Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD. Have you ever been yelled at, really yelled at, and yet somehow it reached a place inside you that no whisper ever could? Sometimes, the only way a soul knows it exists is when someone is loud enough to shake the silence. Today's story begins with a shout in the middle of a quiet restaurant, and ends with a little boy speaking for the very first time, because one woman dared to be loud in the right way. If you believe love isn't always gentle, that sometimes it has to be fierce enough to pierce through fear, like this video and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Stay with us to the very end, because today's loudest voice might just be a lifeline for a child the world has hushed for too long. The restaurant was the kind of place where silence wasn't just expected, it was curated. Soft instrumental music drifted through the air like incense, never loud enough to demand attention, only enough to let the wealthy patrons believe they were hearing themselves think. The walls were paneled in pale wood, minimalist. The servers moved like whispers. Every sound had been trained to step lightly. At a back table, surrounded by the hush of soft-spoken conversation and the clink of porcelain, sat William Ford, 62 years old, razor-sharp suit, silver hair combed so precisely it seemed sculpted. His presence was a command. He didn't speak unless necessary, and when he did, his words landed like court verdicts. A billionaire attorney who'd once sued a contractor over noise pollution, William Ford was the kind of man who used silence like a weapon, and expected the world to comply. Across from him sat his son, Leo, 8 years old. Pale hands resting on the edge of the table, unmoving. In front of him, a small black lacquered bowl of miso soup, steaming gently, untouched. The boy's lips were pressed tight, his eyes unfocused. He didn't look at the soup. He didn't look at his father. He didn't look anywhere. Leo had what the doctors called selective mutism. He didn't speak, not because he couldn't, but because something in him had decided the world wasn't safe enough to speak to. Gentle words didn't reach him. Attempts to coax him out, to meet him in his silence, they'd all failed. Therapists, specialists, even sound therapy had come and gone. Nothing broke through. And so he sat, tiny and frozen, in a room full of people pretending not to notice him. William, stiff-backed, had given up trying to feed him. The soup would go cold, and then the next course would come. He didn't push. He didn't soothe. His approach to parenthood had always been precise, professional, offer every opportunity, remove every obstacle, and the child would grow. Except Leo didn't grow. At least, not in the ways William understood. That was when she walked over. Elise Monroe had worked here for just over 3 weeks. She was 30, tall, slim, with a quiet grace to her movements that didn't quite hide the tension behind her eyes. There was something theatrical in the way she carried herself, a background perhaps in performance. But if that fire had ever burned bright, now it flickered low. She stepped beside Leo, placing a spoon gently next to his bowl. Her uniform was crisp, her steps practiced. She didn't speak at first. Just stood there, looking at the boy. William glanced up, ready to wave her off. But then he stopped. There was something different in her posture, a stillness that didn't belong to servers trained to disappear. She knelt slightly, her face level with Leo's. Her eyes locked onto his. She didn't smile. She didn't baby-talk him. She just stared, not cruelly, but with fierce focus. And then, out of nowhere, she shouted, "Leo, I see you." The words cracked through the restaurant like a gunshot. Every head turned. Chopsticks froze mid-air. A glass clinked loudly as someone dropped it. The music seemed to vanish. Time stalled. Leo blinked. His shoulders flinched, just slightly. His hands twitched. A tremble passed through him, but he didn't look afraid. William shot up from his seat, heart pounding, blood rushing to his face. He couldn't process what had just happened. No one shouted in places like this. No one raised their voice around his son. His first instinct was outrage, legal language forming in his mind like reflex. But he couldn't speak. Because something was happening. Leo's lips parted. A thin whisper scraped out of him, dry and papery, barely audible. Soup. Elise didn't move. She didn't smile or act surprised. She only leaned closer and said, softer this time, "You want the soup now?" Leo nodded. And just like that, the silence in the restaurant deepened. But this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was reverent. William stood frozen, mouth slightly open. He had never heard his son speak in public before. Never seen him respond like that. Not to anyone. Not to him. And the woman who'd made it happen had done the one thing no one else dared do. She raised her voice. For a moment, the world stood absolutely still. The echo of the shout still rang in the air, suspended like dust in sunlight. The sharp, clear call, "Leo, I see you," had shattered the room's cultivated calm. But in the middle of startled glances and whispered gasps, the smallest sound emerged. A single breath. A stuttered syllable. Soup. It wasn't a full word, not really. It was more of a broken vibration, like someone trying to speak through layers of glass and fear. But it came from Leo. And more than anything, it was intentional. His lips had moved. His eyes blinked slowly. He didn't recoil, didn't retreat into his shell. Instead, he stayed where he was, hands trembling slightly, but gaze still locked with the woman kneeling in front of him. Elise didn't smile. She didn't make a scene. She simply lowered her voice and leaned in, letting her presence settle like a warm cloth. "You want the soup now?" she asked gently, as if they were the only two people in the room. Leo nodded once. Small. Definite. A quiet gasp came from someone at another table. But Elise didn't turn her head. Her focus was solely on him, a kind of sacred attention rarely given in this world, especially to children who don't respond the way adults expect. Behind them, William remained frozen. He hadn't sat down. He couldn't. His body was still coiled in the aftermath of instinct, outrage, disbelief, confusion. Yet his voice failed him, trapped somewhere between his lungs and the edge of his tongue. He had just watched his son speak. In public. To a stranger. After years of silence, of professional interventions, of desperate hope and quiet resignation, his boy had whispered a word. Not to him. Not at home. But here, to this woman. Elise rose slowly to her feet, straightened her apron with a smooth motion, and turned toward the kitchen. She didn't look to William. Didn't explain herself. Didn't offer apologies for the disruption, for the volume, for breaking the carefully curated atmosphere of refined civility. "No, I'm sorry, sir. No, it won't happen again." No words at all. She walked calmly past his table, chin level, eyes forward. Her steps were steady, not defiant, but certain. She knew what she had done. And she stood by it. It wasn't until she disappeared into the kitchen that William finally sat back down, legs folding beneath him like brittle scaffolding. His heart was pounding in his chest, his ears still ringing from the shock. Around him, conversation slowly resumed. A few patrons were still stealing glances his way, unsure whether to pretend nothing had happened or brace for an explosion. But William remained silent. His mind was no longer on the room, or the menu, or the reputation he carried like armor. It was on Leo. The boy was still seated, posture tense but present. He looked toward the kitchen door, eyes wide with something that might have been alertness, interest, even expectation. William couldn't stop staring. So many years of therapies and methods. So many carefully measured approaches, calibrated to never overwhelm, to never provoke. And yet none of them had reached Leo. And here, in this place where silence was golden and voices were currency, a waitress had raised hers. Not out of anger, but with purpose. She had seen him. And somehow, Leo had seen her too. A few minutes later, Elise returned, holding a fresh bowl of soup. Steam rose in delicate tendrils. She placed it carefully in front of Leo, then set the spoon beside it, just as before. But this time, she didn't kneel. She didn't stare. She simply stood still for a moment, then spoke in a low, clear tone. "It's warm. Take your time." Leo looked at the bowl. His hands inched forward, hesitant but real. He picked up the spoon, clumsy, uncertain, and dipped it into the broth. A small slurp. Then another. William felt his throat tighten. It was like watching a door creak open, slowly, stubbornly, but undeniably. And Elise, she turned again, wiped her hands on her apron, and moved to her next table. No fanfare. No triumphant smile. She had done what she came to do. Not as a savior. Not as a hero. But as someone who had dared to make herself heard, and in doing so, made room for someone else's voice to rise. The moment the manager arrived at the table, William didn't even look up from his son. His voice, cold and deliberate, sliced through the air like a scalpel. "I want her fired." The manager froze, trying not to glance around at the diners still stealing awkward looks in their direction. "Sir, She shouted at my son. "My disabled son," William interrupted, now rising again from his chair, his expression sharp and unreadable. "I don't care what your protocols are. I don't care what excuse she thinks she has. You do not let your staff scream at children, especially ones who can't defend themselves." His voice didn't rise. It never did. William Ford didn't yell. He didn't need to. His tone carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed without delay. Behind him, Leo continued to sip his soup, oblivious or perhaps simply unbothered. Elise, now back by the kitchen pass, wiping down a tray, looked over, not afraid, not apologetic, simply waiting. The manager shifted nervously. "Mr. Ford, your son, spoke. That's the first time any of us." "That's irrelevant," William snapped. "What she did was reckless. Dangerous. You don't scream at a child with selective mutism. Do you understand the kind of psychological damage that can cause?" There it was. The legal voice. The courtroom authority. The voice that had won him billion-dollar settlements, broken CEOs, silenced journalists. He was back in his element, firm, composed, righteous. Elise approached, having caught enough of the exchange to know she was its subject. She walked slowly, deliberately. Her apron still dusted with flour. Her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her eyes met William's, and held. The manager opened his mouth to speak, but she gently raised a hand. "It's all right," she said calmly. "Let him ask." William turned fully to face her, expression hardening. "Do you have any idea what kind of trauma you could have triggered?" he asked, stepping forward now. "You think yelling at an autistic child is brave? Is helpful? Do you know how long it's taken me to build even a shred of peace for him?" Elise didn't flinch. "I didn't yell at your son," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, but it didn't waver. In fact, it cut through the tension like glass through paper. "I yelled so he could hear something louder than the fear inside his head." The manager blinked. A nearby waiter stopped mid-step. Even William hesitated, not because he agreed, but because he hadn't expected that. Elise continued, steady. "You think I was cruel. But I saw him. I saw how tightly he was holding it all in. No one talks to him like he might talk back. Everyone whispers around him. And he's drowning in it." She glanced briefly at Leo, still eating his soup. Sometimes, the only way to help someone break the silence is to break it first. William didn't speak. His jaw clenched. He wanted to argue. Wanted to demand consequences, to reassert control. But what gnawed at him, what truly unmoored him in this moment, wasn't anger. It was that she wasn't wrong. He had spent years protecting Leo from chaos, from stimulus, from anything unpredictable. And for the most part, it had kept the boy calm. But never connected. Never open. Never speaking. Until today. Still, William was not a man who backed down easily. His voice, when it came again, was colder. "You're not a therapist. You're not trained. You don't know my son." "No," Elise said, her tone respectful but unyielding. "But for one moment today. I think your son knew me." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was electric. William searched her face for arrogance, for mockery, for anything he could object to. But he found only conviction. Not defiance. Not pity. Just the unshaken certainty of someone who had taken a risk, and was willing to stand in the aftermath of it. The manager finally spoke, voice small. "Mr. Ford, if I may." The staff saw what happened. So did the other guests. "We've never seen your son respond to anyone the way he did to Elise. Not even close. I think maybe she reached him." William didn't respond. He glanced once more at Leo, who was now focused on his soup, calm, almost content. The billionaire took a slow breath through his nose, collecting himself. The courtroom part of him wanted resolution. Punishment. But something quieter inside him, something more human, had been shaken. And he didn't yet know what to do with that. The next time Leo returned to the restaurant, the silence was even deeper than before. It wasn't the curated kind, not the kind that made this place feel exclusive, expensive. This was different. Heavier. Tense in all the wrong ways. The staff had heard. Everyone had. The incident with the waitress, the shout, the word, the fallout, had spread like a spark through dry grass. Management hadn't officially let Elise go, but she wasn't on the schedule anymore. And no one said why. Leo entered with his father as usual. The same booth. The same routine. A new waitress, younger, newer, quiet, approached with a stiffness in her shoulders she tried to hide. She was polite. Soft-spoken. Careful. She placed the soup gently before Leo, set the spoon down with reverence, then stepped back like she was afraid to be too near. "Let me know if you need anything," she whispered. Leo didn't respond. He didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't engage. He simply stared down at the bowl. His hands were in his lap, unmoving. His eyes didn't blink much. They wandered, around the room, past the patrons, across the empty space near the kitchen door. There was no spark. No trembling excitement. No hesitant attempt at interaction like last time. The light in his eyes, that flicker that had broken through however briefly, was gone. William sat across from him, watching. He tried not to fidget, not to seem concerned. But he noticed it. Every detail. The difference. He cleared his throat. "It's the same soup as before." Leo didn't look up. "Do you want me to help you with it?" Still no response. William folded his hands, then unfolded them again. His son was back behind that invisible wall, the one they'd spent years trying to crack. A few days ago, it had felt like something had shifted, like a door had creaked open. Now it had slammed shut again. And locked. They finished the meal in quiet. William paid. No incident. No drama. Just routine. At home that evening, Leo went straight to the small whiteboard in his room. It was part of his therapeutic space, a place where he could write thoughts when speaking felt too much. William was about to leave him alone as usual, when he noticed the sound of the marker scratching faintly behind him. He turned. Leo had written 5 words across the board, letters uneven but clear. "Where's the loud one?" William stood still. He read it again. Then again. It hit like a punch to the chest, not just the message, but the clarity of it. The specificity. Leo remembered. Not just the moment, not just the soup. He remembered her. Elise. The woman who had dared to cut through his silence, to speak to him like he existed, loudly, clearly, fully. And now she was gone. William felt a strange pull in his gut. Regret wasn't an emotion he entertained often. In his world, you acted, you justified, you moved on. But this felt different. Leo looked over his shoulder at him, not pleading, not upset, just curious. Waiting. Expecting an answer. William didn't have one. He crouched slowly beside his son, eyes never leaving the board. You liked her. Leo nodded. Simple. Undeniable. William swallowed. Do you know why she's not there anymore? Leo stared at the board for a long moment. Then picked up the marker and erased the question. He didn't write anything else. He didn't have to. The silence that filled the room now wasn't like the kind in the restaurant. This one was honest. Uncomfortable. And William realized for the first time that his son's silence wasn't passive. It was a space where someone had to meet him. Fully. Fearlessly. And the only person who had done that wasn't allowed to anymore. It was nearly midnight when William found himself in the security room of the restaurant. He hadn't planned to be there. The idea had come to him on the drive home after another wordless dinner with Leo. The boy hadn't touched his soup this time. He hadn't looked around. He hadn't written anything on the whiteboard. Just silence. Something gnawed at William's mind, deeper than frustration, more complex than guilt. He needed to understand. He needed evidence. So he called the manager, the same man he had barked at days earlier, and asked for access to the surveillance footage. Now, as the screen flickered in front of him, William leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly. He watched the timestamp roll back to that day. There she was. Elise. He saw her approach the table, calm, steady, attentive. She placed the spoon. She watched Leo. Then she knelt. William's jaw tightened as he anticipated the moment. Even now, knowing what was coming, it still caught him off guard. Her voice pierced through the tinny speaker. Leo, I see you. William's instinctive reaction was the same as before, his spine stiffened. But he kept watching. What he hadn't noticed before, what the camera revealed now in painful detail, was her posture. It wasn't aggressive. Her eyes weren't wild. Her voice, though loud, wasn't angry. She was performing. But not in the self-serving way that made him bristle in courtrooms or board meetings. No. This was different. She was putting on a show, one carefully, consciously, and beautifully designed for a very specific audience. His son. Leo had flinched, yes. But he hadn't recoiled. His hands had trembled, not in fear, but in awareness. And then that whisper, barely audible, had emerged. Soup. William paused the footage. He stared at the frozen frame. Elise kneeling, eyes soft, Leo beginning to move. It looked like a connection. Like the moment someone broke through a fog no one else had even tried to name. Behind him, the kitchen door creaked. A figure leaned in, one of the line cooks, a young man with tired eyes and a damp towel draped over his shoulder. Didn't mean to interrupt, the cook said. Just cleaning up. William nodded but didn't turn. The cook hesitated, then said quietly, that day, it was the first time I ever saw the kid respond to sound. First time he looked like he heard something. William looked over his shoulder, slowly. She found his channel, the cook added. Like she was tuned in, and the rest of us were static. And with that, the young man disappeared back into the kitchen. William returned to the screen. Pressed play. Watched Elise's lips form those words again, saw Leo's barely there nod, the way his eyes shifted toward her with something like trust. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't science. It was theater, not for applause, but for access. A stage for one, with no curtain call, no spotlight, no script. William's breath caught in his throat. For years, he had given his son every possible resource. Doctors, specialists, private schools, tutors. But never, not once, had Leo wanted anyone. Never reached for, looked for, responded to another person. Until now. And William had been the one to remove her. He rubbed his temples, the weight of realization pressing down on him like a slow collapse. Elise hadn't shouted out of ignorance. She hadn't been careless. She had been deliberate. Risking reprimand, risking her job, all for a moment of real contact. He leaned back, suddenly exhausted. All his training, all his legal acumen, all his planning, none of it had prepared him for this. Watching his son come alive, and realizing he'd buried the only person who'd made it happen. The footage ended. The screen returned to its blank feed of dark, empty dining rooms. And William, once the master of composed silence, let his head fall into his hands. The old theater hadn't hosted a show in over a decade. Its marquee was faded, the glass cracked, the name of the last production still ghosting faintly behind grime. Inside, the seats were dusty, the curtains stiff with time, and the stage itself sagged slightly in the middle, as though tired of waiting. But William Ford didn't care. He stepped through the center aisle slowly, his polished shoes echoing on the wooden floor. Light filtered in through a broken skylight, casting long dappled shadows across the ruins of what once had been a home for stories. In his hand, he held an envelope. He stopped at the center of the stage. The wood creaked beneath him, dry and brittle. He looked out across the empty rows of seats, not with nostalgia, but with a sort of unfamiliar humility. This was not his world. He had no control here. That was exactly why he had come. He bent down slowly and set the envelope on a scuffed piece of plywood at the front of the stage. No ceremony. No speech. Just a single folded letter, with neat handwriting on the front. If there's a part for someone who can't speak. I think my son wants to audition. He stood still for a moment, straightening. His fingers lingered at his sides, unsure. Then he turned to leave. A creak came from the wings. He stopped. From the shadows at stage right, a figure emerged. She wasn't in uniform this time. No apron. No tray. Just jeans, a paint-splattered sweatshirt, and hair pulled back in a messy knot. Elise. Her hands were clenched at her sides, not in anger, in restraint. She looked thinner, maybe more tired. But her presence was still unmistakable. She belonged here. Even in a broken place. William didn't speak. Neither did she, not at first. Then softly, she stepped closer to the footlights. I never expected you to come here, she said. Her voice was calm, but something behind it trembled. William nodded once. I didn't come to apologize. I figured. He gestured toward the envelope. I came to ask. Her eyes flicked down at the letter, then back at him. For what? She asked. For space, he said slowly. A space where my son isn't treated like a case study. Where he doesn't need to answer on command or be fixed on someone's timeline. She tilted her head, studying him. I thought you didn't approve of loud people. I still don't, he said dryly. But I'm starting to understand the difference between loud and heard. The quiet stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just deep. Then Elise stepped up onto the stage, her movements fluid. She walked past him, picked up the envelope, read the line on the front. Her thumb traced over the ink. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she looked back at William and said, We'll start with a scene that has no lines. But everyone will hear it. William didn't respond, but something in his face cracked. Not a smile, but the hint of one. A softening. He looked around the theater once more, this place that had nearly swallowed her, and now might give his son a voice. I'm not sure he's ready, he said quietly. No one ever is, she replied. But he wants to try. That's enough. Her eyes flicked to his again. And so do you. Or you wouldn't be here. She reached out and handed him the envelope. He took it slowly, unsure of what to do with it now. This theater was my world once, she said. Then I lost it. I thought I'd never step on this stage again. Why now? Because a little boy looked me in the eye, she said, and for the first time in years I felt heard. William nodded. Then, without another word, he turned and walked up the aisle, his footsteps softer than before. Behind him, Elise stood at center stage, looking out across the dust and light. And for the first time in years, she imagined the seats filled again. Not with critics, but with children. Not with silence, but with possibility. The banner above the theater's entrance read, "Louder Inside." It wasn't fancy. Just white canvas with bold, hand-painted letters. No sponsors, no flashing lights. But inside, something extraordinary was unfolding. What had once been an abandoned shell of a playhouse now hummed with quiet anticipation. Folding chairs filled the aisles. Parents sat shoulder to shoulder, some gripping hands, others holding tissues. Children filled the first few rows, some fidgeting, others unusually still. There was no formal stage curtain, just a single spotlight trained on center stage. Backstage, William stood just beyond view, his hands clasped behind his back, trying not to pace. He had worn a tie, not because the event was formal, but because his nerves needed structure. Every inch of him wanted to control this moment, to shape the outcome. But this wasn't a courtroom. And tonight, he wasn't the one who would speak. He looked down the hallway where Leo stood, small and still in his black button-up shirt and soft shoes. Elise knelt beside him, whispering something only he could hear. She wasn't giving directions, just anchoring him. She touched his shoulder, then stepped back. The lights in the audience dimmed. A hush fell over the room, not forced, but respectful, sacred. Elise stepped on stage first. She stood in the spotlight, arms loose at her sides, the ghost of a smile on her face. "Tonight is not about perfect lines," she said gently. "It's not about polished performances. It's about finding the voice inside, no matter how small or strange or quiet, and letting it come out." Then she looked off stage and nodded. Leo walked out slowly. The audience didn't clap, they knew not to. Every child in this space had sensitivities, some visible, some invisible. Noise could be a wall. So instead, the crowd gave silence, deep, honoring silence. Leo stepped into the spotlight. He didn't fidget. He didn't scan the crowd. He just stood, microphone resting on its stand, both hands at his sides. His eyes found Elise, just off to the left. She spoke, her voice as soft as breath. "And what do you want to say?" There was a pause. A long one. William felt his chest tighten, unsure if his son would speak at all. But then Leo reached up, slowly, and wrapped one hand around the microphone. He pulled it toward him. The feedback squeaked just slightly. No one moved. And then, his voice broke through. Quiet. Raspy. Measured. "Thank you." A flicker of movement in the front row. A mother reached for her husband's hand. "For being loud enough." Leo paused, eyes steady. He took a breath, deep, determined. "To hear me." No applause followed. Just breath. Just tears. Just stillness. Backstage, William pressed a hand to his mouth. Something inside him, something steel-plated and long-armored, cracked. He didn't cry the way people do in movies. No sobbing, no collapsing. Just a single quiet moment when he had to sit down on a folding chair and bow his head. Because in that single sentence, his son had said more than William ever expected to hear. He hadn't needed a legal advocate. He hadn't needed silence. He had needed someone loud enough to find him. And now, standing on a makeshift stage, Leo had found himself too. The lights dimmed. Leo stepped back from the microphone. Elise joined him at center stage, and they walked off together. The audience remained still for a long time before the first soft clap broke through, cautious then swelling, not a roar but a wave. One the boy didn't have to fight against, only ride. Backstage, William stood up and waited. When Leo reached him, he didn't speak. He simply walked into his father's arms, pressing his head gently into his chest. William held him. And for once, there were no words needed at all. Have you ever been told you were too loud? Maybe you were. But maybe, just maybe, someone needed your voice more than you knew. Sometimes, the only way a soul knows it matters is when someone shouts loud enough for it to hear itself. If you believe love isn't always soft, but always arrives exactly when it should, like this video and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And tell us in the comments, who once raised their voice for you when you couldn't speak for yourself?